With the current political climate in America, it seems a conflict is inevitable. Both sides of the political spectrum cannot see eye to eye, and it's only a matter of time before a war breaks out. If you look into the past, we know that America has already been through one civil war in 1861, so if it happened once, it can happen again. But before we get into the logistic of a civil war, we need to understand why one happens. At the heart of most civil wars is who gets the power and who doesn't. Before conflict even breaks out, one group controls the government. When the government and the common people of a country feel disconnected, then this creates a tension that the common people are not being protected or heard. This creates government which the people do not trust, some of which we can see in our own government. Another symptom of a failing government is its use of money. When taxpayer money is not being used responsibly, then people will see the government is not working in their favor, which is not the purpose of a government. Instead, this money is being pocketed or being given to foreign countries. Then people will naturally feel like no matter how they vote, the same thing just keeps happening. Another aspect of a society that is headed to a big conflict is among the youth of its population. If majority of young people are unemployed, then it shows a lack of stable job opportunity. This fuels anger and resentment. With the invention of the internet, it is easy for young people to talk to each other. This leads to people starting to talk about the fate and future of the country, because people need a purpose. If they don't have the ability or opportunity to make a stable income, then they will look for a solution. Another sign that America is not in a good position is the power of the dollar. Before America left the gold standard in 1933 and 71, the American dollar had actual value because it was tied to gold. But once the government decided to get rid of that, then they could print as much money as they wanted. This became what we called fiat money, meaning its value is based on government backing and trust, not gold. If you look at the dollar 100 years ago, in 1926, then we can see that $1 at that time was equivalent to $18 today. And when we compare it to 2026, then the dollar has lost about 94% of its purchasing power over the last 100 years. This is a product of printing money without any real backing. And over the years, it started to build a lot of inflation, which leads us to the current day problem. Saving money has become futile because even if you save money, the government prints money every day, and the money that you have saved in the bank loses value every day, which means it becomes harder for people to pay off debts, causing the price of everyday items to increase, which leads to more pressure on the economy and the country as a whole. Another sign that a civil war is possible is when the state cannot enforce order or legitimacy, which means when the government has a hard time controlling riots and protests, this gives attitude that the police are not strong enough to keep order in the country. This gives the hope for third-party groups to gain traction among the people and say, hey, the system is starting to crack and fall. This also takes legitimacy away from the government. If people no longer believe in the government's ability to serve them, they will find a new master. When people stop believing the state can protect or represent them, they turn to armed alternatives. Furthermore, the situation in America has been on a steady decline for a long time. Many people are in debt and are no longer able to make enough money to take care of themselves. The average American lives paycheck to paycheck. This is not normal. No matter how hard you work, it seems the system is rigged for you to lose. America is in a unique position because it is a world superpower, which means its people should not be living with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. If the dollar keeps losing value, then it will become impossible to buy anything. This will obviously make people upset, and this will further lead to distrust of the US government, making the divide among the people even stronger. Another symptom or sign that a conflict could happen is the rise of crime in a society, and this depends on the level of crime. If it is petty theft and stealing, and it is still seen as wrong, then this does not increase a civil war risk by itself. But on the other hand, if the crime has become organized, then a much more serious situation is at hand. Civil war risk rises when the state loses its monopoly on force, which looks like gangs, militia, and controlled neighborhoods, and police avoid certain areas. Courts fail to prosecute violent crimes. This is a very worrying sign because organized crime acts like government, just on a smaller scale. They have weapons, a command structure, and the only thing stopping them is the force of the state. And if the ability of the state is unable to crack down on organized crime, then these crimes will act as a plague or virus, causing more resistance, which will cost more resources, money for the country. In order to get the money to pay for this service, then they will either print more money or raise taxes, both of which are not good options. The crime in the US appears in different sectors. The first one people think about is drug trafficking organizations, such as Mexican cartels, who dominate wholesale drug supply. Once the drugs enter the country, US-based gangs handle distribution. But these groups do not seek political power or territory in the insurgent sense. The next section is the street gangs, such as MS-13, Bloods, Crips, or Gangster Disciples. They have local or regional control, but they often lack organized ways of fighting, and they have a lot of internal conflict. Another style of crime that is often overlooked is white-collar crime. This is fraud, insider trading, corruption, racketeering. This causes more financial damage and physical violence, but this type of crime hurts trust more than it spills blood. All of these crimes are not good, but they won't start a civil war by themselves. The real risk comes from a systematic threat only if it overlaps with political opposites, like left and right. An example of this would be the cartels in Mexico, which have a stronghold on force within the country, and they also have a heavy influence within the Mexican government, which means bribes, blackmail, and extortion. That's why corruption is so high, because there's no standard law. Now, if we compare that with the US, there's corruption, but to a lower degree. Violence is high in some areas, but state authority is uncontested, for now. But the US government is influenced by foreign countries abroad, which has been brought to light in recent years. Even both sides of the political spectrum agree on this. An example of this would be Epstein and his connections he made during his time in America. He had connections to politicians, academics, and financiers. The 2008 plea deal is the strongest evidence of institutional failure. Epstein received an extraordinarily lenient plea agreement. He was sentenced to 18 months in county jail but served about 13 months, with a work release agreement that allowed him to leave prison during the day, often for many hours. Federal prosecutors later ruled that this process violated victim rights, but it was too late by then. Now imagine if this was the average person. Would they have gotten a sentence like that? What makes Epstein so different? Well, it is because he had infiltrated and blackmailed the majority of the politicians. The Epstein situation needs its own video, but for the purposes of this one, I think it shows the evidence of corruption in the US government. And this just isn't on one side, it happens to both of them. That's why people's faith in the government is starting to slip. This in a bad economy is not making things any better. But if you look to the Civil War in 1861, it didn't all of a sudden just break out. It was already going to split off from the North, which was industrial, urbanizing, and it had wage labor, versus the South, which was agrarian and slave-based. And by the 1850s, Americans trusted different leaders and viewed the other side as a threat to their survival. Compromises were made to keep both sides happy, but this failed because both sides didn't see this as a solution. And once violence became normal in politics, the guardrails were gone. An example of this was in 1856, when Charles Sumner, a U.S. senator, was beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor by Preston Brooks because they couldn't agree on the issue of slavery within the states. More and more uprisings and riots started happening on both sides, which led up to the point where the South wanted their own government, which caused the North to declare war on them. A lot has changed since then. People live different lives and have different mindsets from back then. But one thing we can see is some similarities from the time, mainly the fact that people no longer trust the government and believe that debating is useless, alongside the fact that the economy is hurting, which causes more people to see the writing on the wall, that the current order of things is going to an end. In 1861, you had North versus South. Today we have Democrats versus Republicans. And in the recent past, we had disputes over legitimacy of elections, like the one in 2020. This gives the people the feeling that voting is useless. But in the current world we live in, more people are separated than in 1861. This can be from the internet and how the culture is taught to be more individualistic. This makes it easier for people to be separated, but unity and organization is a threat to the current order. This makes it harder for people to stand up against the state. But on the other hand, political violence is rising, riots and assassination threats, but not normalized nationally. In the past, the dollar was stronger, but now people are crippled economically, which forces people to come together. A key difference to keep things stable is the U.S. military and federal institutions remain professional and loyal to the Constitution. The country is geographically integrated with extensive infrastructure and communication. No elite group openly commands armed forces against the federal government. For example, if you look at the Soviet Union, they were once a big superpower in the world. They had a massive amount of land and military. Most people believe the USSR would last for a very long time. These people believed in a false system. When the USSR collapsed, these people were hit the hardest. One of the similarities that the USSR and America shared is its overextended military. It doesn't just mean too many troops. The USSR during the Cold War felt it had to counter the US everywhere. This naturally wasn't cheap. It cost lots of money to maintain troops in foreign countries with supplies and food alongside military bases that need to be built. They also had to maintain influence across Eastern Europe, Africa, Central Asia, and Latin America. They weren't just defending borders, they were defending an idea. And communism in Eastern Europe wasn't popular. There were many uprisings which costed more resources to be diverted to keep resistance down. Military spending estimated 15 to 25% of GDP. That level is just unattainable long term. Another breaking point for the USSR was the invasion of Afghanistan. It drained resources in a long war. While they controlled the cities, they could not control the countryside. This led to constant ambushes and supply raids. The terrain of the country did not help the Soviets, and constant threat shattered morale. All of this exposed military inefficiency. But the USSR had to make a choice. They didn't have enough money to buy both food and weapons, so they chose weapons. This made living standards stagnated and legitimacy collapsed. Even though there was no free press, people saw the flaws in the system, even if the people at the top didn't. The US doesn't look like the USSR, but the structural stress is similar. The US maintains over 750 overseas bases or facilities. This alone costs billions of dollars, but alongside the bases, the US also acts as a security guarantee across Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. The US has fell into a credibility trap. The US feels it must reassure allies everywhere to keep good favor with these countries, and at the same time, we have to deter rivals everywhere from making alliances with our enemy. This creates a self-reinforcing expansion cycle. The US also had a history of regime changes in the past which have not brought good results. Wars like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, just to name a few, were very expensive, which the people had to pay for. Going into the war, the US had ambitious outcomes with limited strategic payoff. Over time, this erodes public trust and elite confidence, exactly what happened to the USSR. But unlike the USSR, the US financial military spending through debt spending and spread across multiple future generations. This delays crisis, but doesn't eliminate it. But both countries face this problem. The military commitment outgrew the political and economical support needed to sustain it. This is kind of the nail in the coffin. Because once this happens, then legitimacy erodes and political resistance becomes more sustained. But the US is unlikely to collapse the same way that the USSR did. Our economy is more flexible, and we have no internal republics waiting to secede. The real danger is imperial fatigue, not dissolution. This can look like post-imperial Britain, but empires fall when military commitments become symbolic rather than strategic, and retreat is seen as humiliation instead of adapting. If America keeps going down this path, then a few things can happen. The first one being declining trust in institutions such as Congress, media, courts, and elections. Once again, this is a demoralized campaign which causes a loss of trust in the government. The second thing that can happen is economic strain on the dollar. If the government keeps printing money, then the dollar loses relative global dominance, which opens the door for our allies to turn to other economic currencies like BRICS. And if that happens, America will lose international influence. This will make the divide between the middle class and the upper class even stronger. And as seen before, public support for endless global policing is fading. The propaganda that was used before to justify these wars has now been challenged with the use of independent journalists through the internet. And within the country, there is a divide on internal disagreement, such as America's role in the world, the amount of immigration in the country, and the use of force inside the country. These problems make people fall more into left and right. Now, if a civil war broke out, what would it look like? Well, it certainly wouldn't look like what happened in 1861. It wouldn't be blue versus gray, but it would be more fragmented and messy. A modern US civil war wouldn't be two clear armies with capitals and uniforms. It would likely be fragmented violence rather than one clean front. Multiple actors with overlapping motives. This would be multiple factions, not just left versus right. There would be even more conflicts within the states, where each faction would fight over power. Governors, mayors, courts, and federal authorities would fight for control of the state. Another battlefield that would open up would be social media. Each group will use media to push out their own propaganda against the other. They will also use social media as a way to get more people to fight on their side. This might be the most important part of the internal conflict, because with the use of the internet, you can reach much more people than before. Now, a good question is what would happen to the military in case of a civil war? Under Article 2 of the Constitution, the President is Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces. This authority exists at all time, war or peace. The President will not act as a general, but he will set overall objectives and authorize uses of force. The Insurrection Act is a law that allows the President to deploy federal troops inside the U.S., and he can override state authorities if they cannot or will not enforce federal law. This can also happen outside a civil war. Even in extreme internal conflicts, the chain of command will stay the same. For example, orders flow from the President to the Secretary of Defense and then to the military commanders. The military remains institutional. Generals do not swear loyalty to the President as a person, but to the Constitution. But the generals could take power by force if they feel like the President is too weak. At that point, U.S. military would be forced to pick political sides. On the ground, whoever controls the infrastructure like power grids and field distribution and ports would have a massive advantage. A choke point would be large cities because they are extremely dense, so they need to be besieged. But not in the traditional sense with armies and tanks. Modern cities are way too big for this to happen. There are dozens of entry points, into and exiting the city. And you also have miles of suburbs blending into other cities. To physically surround a city like LA or Chicago, you would need hundreds of thousands of troops, and they need to be constantly supplied. That's not realistic for internal factions. But you don't need to surround a city to choke it. Cities rely on electricity, fuel, food deliveries, and water treatment. If you disrupt a few key ports, substations, refineries, and rail hubs, then the city feels besieged without anyone standing at the edge with rifles. Plus, urban combat is a nightmare. No side wants to fight block by block if they can avoid it. The reason why is because of a massive civilian presence in the city. These people could be armed, and you do not know who is a non-combatant versus a partisan. Now, another problem could arise from this is people leaving the city in massive ways. This causes a strain on roads and supply lines. People running away from the cities will go into the countryside or other towns, which can cause more problems than solutions. But this could take months, depending on the supplies within the city and the people's willingness to keep fighting. whereas fighting in the open field will not take as long. In the end, whoever wins will have the ability to claim to be the true American government. This will increase their legitimacy among the people and put down any resistance, but a conflict like this would leave millions of people dead, not just from direct conflict, but from lack of food and water. A big difference between the war in 1861 and modern day is that people back then didn't really rely on the government for survival. Most of the Southerners were farmers, which meant at the very least they could feed themselves, versus today where most people live in urban communities, which means they rely on food being brought from somewhere else. Most people could hunt, but there wouldn't be enough food for everyone, just by hunting alone. A scenario like this would not be good, but anything is possible. That means everyone should always be prepared for the worst. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think America is headed to a civil war? If you like this type of content, subscribe for future videos.